Dear beloved, thank you for choosing to be part of this growing community. Your decision to join us is a true act of love and support. It means a lot to see people standing with others as they share their life stories, experiences, and testimonies. Here, you'll find real stories that can inspire change, build your faith, and lift you up when you need it most. We also kindly ask that you like, comment, and share our videos. Your support helps us reach more people and make a bigger impact. God bless you. My name is Tariq. I grew up in a world of impeccable order. My parents were immigrants who had worked relentlessly to build a life defined by two things: success and devotion. For us, the two were inseparable. Success meant providing a secure future. Devotion meant fulfilling every single obligation, every ritual, every prayer, every fast, perfectly and without fail. Our life was like a beautifully structured building, solid and symmetrical, and Islam was the blueprint. I was the eldest son, and my future was mapped out with the precision of a satellite launch. University, a professional career, I chose finance, drawn to the challenge and the rewards. Marriage, and a family that would continue the lineage of devotion and prosperity. I accepted this architecture readily. It wasn't a burden. It was a roadmap to a guaranteed good life, in this world and the next. For 25 years, I excelled at the performance. I was a man of routines. 5 times a day, I would drop my work, find a clean space, and perform my salah. I memorized portions of the Quran, volunteered, and felt the warm, comforting sense of righteousness that comes from keeping all the lights green. My concept of God, of Allah, was powerful, majestic, and defined by justice. He was a magnificent king who had laid out the law, and my salvation was the direct result of my diligent obedience. I was earning my place in paradise, one good deed at a time. This belief system wasn't rooted in love. It was rooted in the terror of failing a flawless, all-seeing judge. And then, the architecture cracked. It didn't happen because of a moral failure or a financial collapse, as it does for some. It happened because of something invisible, something inside my own head that I couldn't control, crushing anxiety and generalized panic disorder. It started subtly. A tremor in my hands before a presentation. A sudden, cold wash of dread walking into the busy office. I dismissed it as high-stakes stress. But the anxiety began to metastasize, spreading from my professional life into my personal one, and eventually, into my faith. The first full-blown panic attack hit me one Friday afternoon. I was standing in the packed mosque, shoulders touching, listening to the khutbah. Suddenly, the air felt thin. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. My vision tunneled. A terrifying, irrational thought screamed in my mind. I am dying. This is it. I'm having a heart attack right here, right now, in the middle of prayer. I stumbled out, sweat pouring off me, convinced I was collapsing. I drove myself to the emergency room, only to be told, hours later, that my heart was perfectly fine. You had a severe panic attack, the doctor said calmly. I felt immense shame. Panic. It sounded weak, effeminate, a failure of control. The man who had everything under control, his career, his finances, his dean, was suddenly being controlled by an unseen, internal monster. Over the next 6 months, the panic became my constant companion. It was the feeling of standing on a glass floor that might shatter at any second. My thoughts became polluted with relentless, looping worry. What if I go crazy? What if I lose control? What if I die and face God right now, knowing I'm a mess? I couldn't sleep. I lost 20 pounds. I was constantly nauseous. The world, once ordered and logical, had become a minefield. But the worst part was the spiritual crisis it triggered. My anxiety didn't just affect my body, it attacked my theology. In my mind, a perfect life of obedience should have granted me peace, sakina. If I was following the blueprint, the building shouldn't be collapsing. I turned to my faith with renewed desperation, believing that the panic was a punishment for an unknown sin, or a sign that my faith was too weak. I began to pray harder, longer. I added voluntary fasts. I spent hours reciting dhikr, remembrance of God, repeating the powerful 99 names of Allah, searching for the name that would deliver me. I would whisper the throne verse, Ayat al-Kursi, over and over again, believing it was a shield against this internal attack. But the panic king didn't listen to my incantations. I would start a prayer, and the sheer physicality of the anxiety, the shortness of breath, the racing thoughts, would make it impossible to concentrate. I would break the prayer, convinced I had failed the ritual, and the anxiety would spike higher, fueled now by guilt and spiritual condemnation. I sought counsel from respected imams. They offered kind, but ultimately insufficient, advice. You need more tawakkul, trust in God. This is a trial. You must be patient. Perhaps you have abandoned an obligation. Examine your heart. Recite more Qur'an. It is a healing. I tried it all. I read the Qur'an until my eyes blurred. But when the crushing dread returned, it felt like God's own voice saying, "You are not worthy of my peace. Your efforts are insufficient." The faith that was supposed to be my anchor became a heavy chain, dragging me down. If my salvation depended on my performance, and my illness made performance impossible, then I was truly, utterly lost. The core belief of my life, that I could earn my way to God, was refuted by the reality of my broken mind. I hated myself. I hated my weakness. And I hated the distant, unyielding judge who seemed to demand perfect health and perfect performance from a man who could barely get out of bed. I stopped praying altogether. I withdrew from the mosque. I told my family I was simply too busy with work. The architecture had not only cracked, it had collapsed into dust, leaving me standing exposed and terrified in a spiritual void. The next phase was purely medical. The psychiatrist diagnosed me with severe generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, and comorbid major depressive disorder. Pills helped dull the edges of the panic, allowing me to function minimally, but they did nothing for the existential despair. I was a functioning, medicated ghost. I began to ask deeper, darker questions. If God is the ultimate healer, why is this outside the reach of my faith? If all power is His, why did He allow this weakness to consume me? In my search for answers that transcended religious obligation, I wandered into a small, old bookstore near the hospital. I was looking for something, anything, that dealt with suffering and meaning outside the rigid, transactional framework I had known. I picked up books on Eastern philosophy, Stoicism, and even some secular psychology texts. But none of them addressed the guilt. None of them addressed the shame of feeling spiritually inadequate before a perfect God. It was in the back corner of the store, among the neglected religious texts, that I found it, a worn, slightly dusty paperback titled The Transforming Power of the Cross. I recognized the author's name as a prominent Christian philosopher. I picked it up, not out of spiritual interest, but out of intellectual hostility. I wanted to dismantle this foreign faith, to find its hypocrisies, to confirm my newly cemented cynicism. I intended to use the book as a weapon, but the first paragraph I read arrested me. The human heart is burdened by one fundamental, universal truth. We are broken. We cannot fix ourselves. We constantly strive to earn love, earn worth, and earn peace. And every single panic attack, every episode of self-loathing, is the natural consequence of trying to bear a burden that was never meant for human shoulders. The idea that my suffering wasn't a punishment, but the result of trying too hard to be perfect, hit me with the force of revelation. My whole life had been about lifting the burden of performance. I bought the book. I went back to my apartment, took my medication, and started reading. The story of the prophet Jesus, Isa, whom I had always revered but never truly known, began to unfold in a way that was entirely new. He wasn't presented as a distant, rules-based teacher. He was presented as an incarnation, God stepping down into the mess of human frailty. I read about Jesus weeping, about his own suffering in Gethsemane, a profound anxiety attack before his betrayal. Here was God, experiencing human dread. Here was a figure who knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of what lay ahead. The revelation wasn't theological yet, it was deeply, violently personal. Jesus wasn't judging my panic, he had experienced it. He wasn't demanding my perfection, he was meeting me in my breakdown. I continued to read, my mind tearing down and rebuilding concepts I had held sacred for decades. The notion of original sin, that humanity is inherently flawed, broken from the start, was no longer a philosophical puzzle, but a direct mirror to my own illness. My anxiety wasn't a failure of my will, it was a symptom of a deeper, universal spiritual sickness. And then came the central, impossible, beautiful concept that the world I knew had fiercely rejected, the crucifixion and resurrection. I had always been taught that the cross was a scandal, a sign of prophetic failure, a divine escape act. But reading it now, through the lens of my anxiety, I saw a different narrative. It was the ultimate act of substitution. The weight of my religious obligation, the shame of my failure, the crushing debt of my imperfection, all the things that had fueled my anxiety and depression, were laid upon the one who could bear it. It wasn't about earning my way back to God. It was about receiving a gift I was utterly incapable of earning. My God wasn't just justice. He was utterly, recklessly, unconditionally loving. This was not a transaction. It was a radical, undeserved surrender. This concept of grace was the spiritual defibrillator my heart needed. It meant my illness was not a punishment, but a place where the unconditional love of God, embodied in Jesus, could finally meet me in my weakest, most broken state. If you haven't comment, or share, please do. I wasn't saved by reciting a prayer perfectly. I was saved by a broken man who bore my shame, so I didn't have to. This was the spark. But the transition, the acceptance, and the fight to live this new truth in the face of my chronic illness and cultural rejection, that was the true battle for redemption. It was a battle fought in the quiet terror of midnight panic attacks, armed with nothing but the radical promise of a love I could never lose. The moment of belief is always swift. The lifetime of discipleship is slow. I had accepted the incredible truth of Christ's sacrifice, but putting that truth into practice while navigating the wreckage of my mind and the demands of my culture felt impossible. The faith I found was revolutionary, but my application of it had to be a quiet, clandestine operation. My first fear was the shame of being discovered. Not the shame of having anxiety, but the shame of the inevitable label, apostate. In my community, this was worse than death. It meant cultural execution, the complete severance from the people who defined my world. I started reading the New Testament in secret, often hiding it beneath my mattress or disguised within one of my finance textbooks. I listened to sermons online with headphones, terrified my neighbor would hear the sound of a cross being referenced. I knew I needed community. I was too ill and too spiritually vulnerable to walk this path alone. After weeks of debilitating hesitation, I searched for a small, non-denominational church near my office. I chose one that looked physically unassuming, not a massive cathedral, but a simple building that felt less intimidating. The first Sunday I went, I felt like an undercover spy. My heart rate was through the roof, a classic panic symptom fueled by the fear of being seen by someone who knew my family. I sat in the very last row. I didn't sing. I didn't speak. I simply watched the people. What struck me wasn't the ritual, which was so foreign, so different from the practiced precision of Salah, but the openness. The sermon was about forgiveness. The pastor spoke about how God knew we would fail, not just occasionally, but systematically. He talked about the burden of carrying our own sin, and how Christ had invited us to lay that burden down. He used an analogy that hit me hard. You wouldn't try to climb a mountain while carrying the mountain itself. But that's what we do when we try to earn God's love. I didn't leave converted to a denomination, but I left convicted by a spirit. I began to attend regularly, still sitting in the back, still silent, but soaking up the environment of unconditional welcome. I saw people whose lives were clearly messy. They cried during worship, they looked tired, they weren't perfect, and yet they spoke about God's love as a certainty, not a prize to be won. This was the antithesis of the culture of performance that had driven my anxiety to its breaking point. The greatest miracle of my conversion was not the instantaneous cure of my anxiety. I still had, and still manage, my GAD and depression, but the radical change in how I related to it. The healing wasn't the removal of the fight. It was the rearmament with a faith that made the fight meaningful. The teachings of Jesus became the most powerful cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, I could ever receive. 2 passages, in particular, became my daily armor against the looping terror of my mind. 1. The end of worry, Matthew 6 verses 25 to 34. I had spent my life worrying about the future, about performance, about what I would eat, wear, or achieve. This passage, where Jesus talks about the birds and the lilies, telling his followers, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own, became my spiritual mantra. Before, my anxiety was a theological problem. If I worry, I lack faith in Allah's plan, so I am sinful and deserve punishment. This guilt compounded the anxiety. Now, Jesus wasn't judging the worry. He was simply dismantling the necessity of it. He offered a divine permission to focus only on this breath, this hour, this day. This relieved me of the colossal, imaginary burdens of an entire lifetime of future failures that I had been pre-living. I learned to pray not for the removal of the panic, but for the strength to endure the minute I was in, trusting that the next minute was already covered by grace. 2. The light yoke, Matthew 11 verses 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This passage was the direct antidote to the architecture of obligation. The transactional faith had demanded I wear a yoke of perfection, a burden that weighed thousands of pounds. When my mind became ill, I was unable to lift that weight, and the resulting guilt was crushing. Jesus offered an exchange. He took the heavy yoke of my performance, my sin, my cultural expectation, and offered the light yoke of his presence and his finished work. I learned that my salvation was not dependent on how well I managed my anxiety, but on the simple fact that I was already loved by the one who had borne my burdens. The weight of earning peace was gone. Peace was a gift, given freely, which allowed my mind to slowly, tentatively, begin the process of healing. I was still anxious, but the guilt that made the anxiety unbearable was gone. The secret couldn't last forever. The physical changes in me were too obvious. The weight gain, the cessation of panic attacks, they became manageable instead of debilitating. And, most tellingly, the new, quiet joy that replaced my constant cynicism. My mother, observant and intuitive, noticed I was no longer praying Salah. She asked me about it gently, fearing I had abandoned God. I tried to deflect, talking about finding a deeper, more personal faith. But my father, sharp and driven by tradition, saw the small, plain cross necklace I had started wearing beneath my shirt collar, visible only when I was careless. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and utterly heartbreaking. "What is this, Tariq?" he demanded, pulling the chain out from under my shirt. His voice wasn't loud. It was the controlled, dangerous sound of a man watching his life's work disintegrate. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The panic, the failure of the performance-based faith to save me, the crushing despair, and the discovery of the unconditional grace of Jesus Christ. I spoke not with rebellion, but with absolute conviction and a heart breaking for the pain I was causing. "You have abandoned the truth," my father said, his eyes empty. "You have traded your heritage for a pagan fantasy. You have disgraced the name of our family, and you have put your soul in peril." My mother wept silently, a sound that cut me deeper than my father's anger. To them, I hadn't simply changed religions. I had committed spiritual and cultural suicide. All the architecture they had built, the success, the devotion, the future generations, had crumbled because of my decision. The ensuing weeks were a blur of pleading, ultimatums, and silence. I was told to recant, to return to the path, to choose my family over my delusion. I couldn't. I loved them, but I couldn't go back to the religious slavery that had almost killed me. The final conversation ended with my father giving me a choice: abandon the cross and return home, or leave and never return. With tears streaming down my face, I hugged my mother one last time, told them I loved them, and walked out of the house that had been my entire world. The loss was devastating. It was the deepest cut possible, the severing of the most sacred bond in my culture. The anxiety returned with a vengeance, but this time, it was different. This time, I was holding the light yoke. I lost my family, my community, and my cultural identity, but I gained an intimacy with God I never knew existed. I moved into a shared apartment, took a less demanding job, and dedicated myself to managing my mental health and deepening my faith. The healing was not instantaneous. It was a process. The anxiety is still a part of my story, a chronic illness I manage with prayer, therapy, medication, and the constant application of grace. But the difference is this. Before, anxiety was proof of my sin, a mark of God's disappointment, and a signal that I needed to perform better. It was a sentence of isolation. Now, anxiety is an illness, a result of my human frailty, and a constant reminder that I am not God. It is the alarm clock that tells me I need to stop striving and start resting in the love of Jesus. It is a reminder that my salvation is not in my strength, but in His. The faith I found in Christ gave me a person, not a protocol. I stopped worshipping a distant king of justice and started clinging to a loving Father who sent His Son, the healer, to walk through the valley of the shadow of death and depression with me. When a panic attack hits today, I don't recite a complicated Arabic prayer perfectly. I simply whisper, Jesus, I cannot carry this. You carry me. Your yoke is easy. And in that moment of absolute surrender, the peace that the world and the faith of my youth could not provide settles over me. It is the peace that passes all understanding, a peace that is not the absence of struggle, but the certainty of companionship. That is my story of hope and redemption.